Well, with us on the line is Ashley Edwards. Ashley, do you prefer Ashley or Ash?
Look, either way, just as long as it's just as long as you call me by my name, right?
There we go.
Look, either way, it's fine with me. I think Ash is kind of the nickname, and Ashley's what most people know me as.
Yeah, well, I was sitting here when I saw the screen that had Ash on it. I thought, gosh, we worked together for 5 years. I hope I didn't call him the wrong name the whole time we were working together. So,
right.
Well, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. How about yourself?
Doing well. Appreciate you taking some time to be with you. Enjoyed your piece on the Trump indictment.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, look, arguably one of the biggest stories in American political history, right? So, it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds.
Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on where things stand there.
Well, I think it's interesting. The piece that I wrote for SuperTalk, it was sort of a cautionary tale. You look at the division, the polarization that exists in the United States today. Arguably in modern history, we've not seen political polarization on the level that we see it today. And
I agree.
When you start to look at the stakes with a former American president being potentially arrested, frankly, a current candidate for president being arrested, the potential here to have issues that go well beyond things that we've discussed in American politics before is right upon us. And these next 2 years leading up to the 2024 election, they're going to be interesting to watch because, and one of the things I mentioned in that column, and I think it kind of bears repeating, Lucien, this is not going to be just Democrats versus Trump. There are other vicious GOP hopefuls who are also going to, I think, sort of jump on attacking the Trump train as we go on here. And so fire is going to be coming in from all sides of the aisle.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you're also right about the indictment. I mean, it's having an affair is not a good thing. Paying hush money is not a good thing. But with to your point about the polarization in the country, you're about to indict a former president and current candidate for what's at best a misdemeanor under New York law that's almost certainly past the statute of limitations. I mean, that doesn't mean it's a good thing that this happened. Right. But the idea that you're going to go after anybody for this far past the time when it happened just feels like a political, whether it is or whether there's a good justification or not, it feels like a politically motivated prosecution.
It does, no question about it, and I think you're spot on. Look, the level of care that ought to be taken to indict a major political figure, the leader of a political movement in the United States, is a high bar. And you listen to the talking heads on the nightly news, and you keep hearing over and over and over people that will say something like, "Well, no one is above the law," and that's true. I mean, the rule of law is sacred in America. But there is also something else that's true, and that is, despite no one being above the law, the indictment of Donald Trump affects an entire country.
Right.
It is something that is going to create reverberations throughout the political realities that we're going to face for years to come. And so, again, the level of care in indicting a former president and a current candidate for president has to be a very high bar.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think your point about polarization is also just spot on because the temperature is so high in American politics right now. And I think there's blame to go around for why it's so high. But, every conversation that you see from at a high level in politics, people are always, the other side is never described just as the opposition. It's almost like they're enemies of the state. They're autocrats, they're communists, and I think a lot of people listen to that and they recognize that's just a sort of overheated rhetoric that gets used. But there's a small portion of the population that I think takes those sorts of statements literally, and my view is that it gets to the point of being literally dangerous to have that kind of rhetoric out there.
I think it is, because it's becoming so commonplace. It's becoming such a part of our normal political vernacular. And, Lucien, I mean, look, I think the bottom line to all of this is there are some big issues in the world today, whether it's geopolitics across the globe, whether it's this sort of instantaneous transformation that we're seeing in our economy, what's going on with inflation, the financial systems, the banking crisis that could be upon us. We're going to have to be in a position where the warring political parties in the United States are going to have to work together on some big society-altering projects and issues. And, arguably this is the worst time to fall into this sort of polarized gridlock over a presidential candidate. The stakes couldn't be higher. And it's a little scary when you think about what we could be facing over the next few years in the lead up to the 2024 election.
You have to think that some of our enemies, the Chinese government, the Russian government, others, have to be celebrating a little bit the kind of turmoil that we've got over here. Because to your point, there are major issues in the world that are going on, and we are spending time fighting each other, sometimes in silly, overheated ways, while they're busy forming alliances around the world to increase the influence of the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, no question about it. And President Xi in China, I mean, you look at what's going on right now, they are carefully positioning themselves to sort of lead the new world order in the 21st century. That was clear with the visit to Russia.
Right.
The thing that was so striking to me about watching Xi and Putin as they spoke at, in Moscow was just the realization that Xi holds all the power in that relationship. In many ways, the geopolitics in the world right now, they're working their way right into his hands. I mean, right into his trap, exactly where he wanted things. And so, this is going to be pretty incredible to watch. The Cold War, people talk a lot now with what's going on in Ukraine and say, hey, this is the remnants of the Cold War. But we're about to see a new Cold War begin with China, and let's just hope that it stays a Cold War.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And we've benefited from having a effectively 30 years of U.S. global domination. I mean, we were in something of a bipolar world with the Soviet Union until its collapse, and we've been the dominant player worldwide. And you're right, Ashley, there's no doubt that the Chinese are trying to make themselves a rival to the U.S., and I think their end game is ultimately to overtake us, and that needs to be, in my view, the number one focus of the country in terms of our foreign policy is making sure that we remain the global hegemon, because a world that's run by the U.S. is just going to be a fundamentally better world than a world that's run by people who think like Xi Jinping.
No question. No question. I mean, there is, vast competition in the world today. You look at the Chinese plan for peace in Ukraine. Let's face it, Lucien, China doesn't want peace in Ukraine as long as Russia is being castigated by the world, as long as they're under, crippling economic sanctions from the West. China's going to be able to buy their energy, their products. China ultimately is going to be in an economic position to take advantage of the situation in Russia. And right now, the status quo is good for them. One of the reasons that the United States has to quickly bring about changes in the status quo, because China ultimately benefits as long as we continue to have this type of instability.
Well, in the New York case specifically, I mean, do you have a sense of what you think the best outcome there would be? I mean, would that be for the district attorney not to indict, or what would be your prescription there?
Well, look, I mean, for the good of the country, it just seems to me from a pragmatic standpoint that the New York Democrat Manhattan Attorney General, where you've had fiery, divisive rhetoric coming out of the Attorney General's office for years as they've been investigating Trump, should not be the first to go in indicting a former president. There are bigger issues that are being investigated. There are higher standards of federal conduct with the special counsel of the Justice Department. It'd be nice to see that play out before you have something like this go down to New York, but it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. It doesn't look like New York is going to go first.
I think you're right. Can you stick with us for one more segment, Ash?
Sure, be happy to.
Hey, this is Lucien Smith in for Paul Gallo on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi. Stick with us for more with Ashley Edwards. This on the line is Ashley Edwards talking a little bit about the article he wrote about the potential Trump indictment in New York over what feels like a kind of tortured legal theory. You know, one thing, Ashley, that I've seen some people say, the prosecutors, the whole idea is there's prosecutorial discretion, right? That they need to be making a decision about is this a case that merits the use of state force, essentially, to potentially send somebody to jail for an extended period of time because, you know, laws can't be perfectly constructed. And that's a long-standing tradition in Anglo-American law that you don't prosecute every offender for every offense, that you ought to be using some discretion. It's one of the reasons that prosecutors are so often elected is you want them to be responsive to the voters as they figure out who the right indictments are and the wrong ones are. And this certainly feels like a moment where a prosecutor who wasn't politically motivated would say, you know what, this is really in the nature of a technical violation from from many years ago outside the statute of limitations. We ought not be spending public money to prosecute this, even if it was just a person who wasn't a former president of the United States.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Lucien. I mean, there is I think a compelling case to be made that what happens in Manhattan could undermine other investigations that are occurring both in Georgia and, of course, at the federal level. And I think it's interesting to see what Trump's strategy and his approach has been to this, because he looks at it through the lens of, look, bring it on. This is only going to make me politically stronger. Because this is a glowing example of how we're under political persecution here. You're going to hear a lot of rhetoric, I think, coming out of his camp. They're going to say, look, they hate you, they hate me, and this is what they do to people they hate. You got to fight against this. And if you're the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, you cannot claim that there has not been a long and sustained sort of fishing expedition here to pin something on Donald Trump. And so,
right.
The question is the country ready for this? Is this ultimately going to do collective good to our politics, to our discourse, to our trust in our institutions, to our trust in democracy? And it just seems to me that across the board, the answer on that is no. This is not going to make us stronger as a nation. And so, there again, I would never advocate, Lucien, that someone who is guilty of a crime shouldn't be held accountable. But again, we don't know the facts. We don't know the evidence collected in the case. And given the nature of some of the other investigations that are occurring, again, it is difficult to watch New York be the first one to potentially indict a former president of the United States. Especially considering that their case is, I think, arguably the smallest and really and least important of the ones that we know of that are out there.
I think that's right, and that's a subtle point, but an important one. I mean, there are these other investigations going on, and if one of them were to uncover serious wrongdoing, if the president gets indicted on this tortured theory that may or may not be able to be proven, and then he's able to say, look, these are all just trumped up political prosecutions, it really undermines all of those efforts in service, in my view, to the political interest of that Manhattan DA.
Well, no question about that. And, and it's sort of what is the goal here? Is the goal of the Manhattan DA just to have a media circus? Is it even possible to prosecute what could potentially be a felony indictment in the Trump case? I've heard a lot of legal experts on both sides who agree that that's going to be a difficult thing to do. And so, what if nothing comes of this? What if we go through all of this, it becomes headlines across the world, and ultimately they're not in a position that they can convict President Trump on anything? I mean, the stakes are really high, and it would be different potentially if he weren't a current candidate for president. I mean, certainly there's going to be political backlash from a former president, especially one that has the kind of loyalty that Donald Trump has. But as a current candidate for office, That's just a really, really tough precedent to set without, frankly, what was identified by our founding fathers in the Constitution, which are sort of the high crimes doctrine, right? That really ought to be the standard for something that has this type of disruption on America's politics.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, especially with things as heated as they are right now. And I think it would be good for the country if everybody in public office would take steps to try to turn that temperature down, and that includes the former president. I mean, I think the president's comments, President Trump's comments about how people need to take to the streets if he's indicted, that's also, I think, very, very unhelpful. And we've seen what happens with that kind of overheated rhetoric on our side too. But I think we all just need to make an effort as a country to take those temperatures down. I know that's not necessarily a popular position on either side because you raise a lot more money and get a lot more volunteers by turning that temperature up. But the country would be much better off, I think, if we could accept that the folks on the other side may be wrong on policy, but they're not enemies of America. And I think that goes for Republicans and Democrats.
Completely agree with that, and very well said, Lucien. I mean, look, I think that with the issues that we're facing in the world right now, there's no question that we're going to have to find ways to be unified as a people, as a country. You think about great times of national unity, and oftentimes those times coincided with big world challenges, big security challenges across the world. And we're in that era now. There's no question about that. And so, we stay divided to our own detriment at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, on a more local topic, how's our Gulf Coast doing? I know you've spent a lot of your time professionally, both restoring and building other things down there and supporting the business community and being part of it. How's the Gulf Coast doing?
Look, the Gulf Coast is doing great. We've had two really great economic years back to back here. You think about the beginning of the pandemic and how really scared we were here on the Gulf Coast. There had been some national economists that predicted that the Mississippi Gulf Coast region could be one of the 5 hardest hit MSAs in the country based on the reliance on gaming and tourism. That did not come into being. In fact, we actually had a record year in 2021, near record year in 2022. 23 looks like it's going to be a great year. So despite the fact that we're seeing some economic weakening in the rest of the country, despite some of the concerns that we're seeing with inflation and raising interest rates, we've not seen the level of economic disruption here on the coast yet that we've seen in some other places. And so, so far so good. The coast is booming, and hey, it's a great place to be.
It is a great place to be. I don't get down to the coast nearly enough. And when did you leave the Gulf Coast Business Council?
So the end of last year. So I've only been a couple of months now out in the private sector. My last day at the Gulf Coast Business Council was December 31st. And of course, Jamie Miller, who came from the Mississippi Development Authority, and he is now my successor, taking over that agency, doing a great job. And look, it's so very important that the Business Council, which I led for 7 years, you sort of look at the business community across the coast. It really is one of the threads that sort of links the coast together. We're a series of towns and cities here that are separated by common borders, but oftentimes we've not worked well together down here on the coast. The business community is one of the sort of the great hopes in that future, because at the end of the day, they understand that we have to have regional strength and regional alignment to be able to succeed.
Well, it's a great organization. It's a great region of a great state down there, and I know you did a good job, a great job when you were running it. And I think the world of Jamie, and I'm confident he's going to do a great job running the business council.
No question about it.
As we get towards the end of the legislative session, is there anything you're particularly following, or anything you want to see the legislature do that would be helpful for the business community?
Well, look, there have certainly been some issues that have been on the agenda this year. I mean, the business community down here is very interested to see what's going to happen with state policy as it relates to things like taxes. Medicaid expansion has been a big issue down here on the coast because we've got some major hospitals down here that have been just hit hard by the overall healthcare environment that we've been in, and Mississippi really and nationally. And so, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with those issues as time goes on. This has been a very active legislative session, especially for a election year. So it's an interesting dynamic that we see here on the coast, because ultimately what affects Mississippi affects the coast, and sometimes is even amplified here in the coastal counties. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens in these closing days as the legislative session comes to a halt.
No doubt about it. Ashley, thanks for taking the time to be with us. This has been Ashley Edwards. This is Lucien Smith, in for Paul Gallo on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk, Mississippi.